Hello and welcome to Small Things Brought Together. My name is Robin Love. Small Things Brought Together is an ongoing series of conversations with artists and others about creative process. So these are long format conversations where we take the time to dig deep, circle back, even sit in silence and just reflect so that we can get beyond the sound bites and surface level and really find out what is the creative process. So I'm delighted to have with me today Erin Donovan. Erin is based in Nova Scotia. She is a multidisciplinary artist, but I'm going to say, and you can correct me, primarily a musician, or started primarily as a musician, composer, and for the last 25 plus years has been making these collaborative, interdisciplinary events, site specific events across Canada, um, that and more, and that bring in all kinds of other performers and artists in a really interesting way. So, welcome, Erin. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here with you.
Hmm. So, is there anything you'd like to add to that introduction? That is a very brief introduction. So, yeah, any about your background or some that would be good for people to know.
Yeah, I guess, I sometimes don't even know how to describe myself anymore because I've gone through a lot of um different types of iterations, I guess, of how I like to make art. But in terms of music, which has kind of been my main focus for a long time, that I my actual, training is in percussion. So I'm primarily a percussionist. I do play other instruments also, but but what I found was the training that you get as a percussionist kind of leads you to places that I wasn't as interested in as places that say a dancer might end up, or a theater artist or a writer might end up. So I think that's where the interdisciplinary work kind of started to come in.
So, can you say a little more about what you mean by that? Like, does that mean you end up in an orchestra?
Yeah. Yeah. When you're training, you don't think about where you're going to end up. You're just like, I'm just learning all the things I can about playing this drum, And I like learning. I've always been, a really active learner. So I just followed my nose because I grew up in Newfoundland. So I was very lucky to have, like, my first teacher was Don Wary, who is the person who created the Sound Symposium. So that throwing, ping pong balls at gongs and pushing things off of cliffs, and that was all very normal when I was a kid. I just thought that's what music was. And we would get together at his house on Circular Road, and there would be poets and visual artists and listen to music and have conversations. And I think that's what really excited me. That's where I was like, oh, this is what I'm interested in. But then as I followed the training, I went to some pretty serious classical schools, and it's really like being a ballerina. Like, oh, I ended up at the National Ballet School or whatever, not thinking that, oh, at the end of that, I'm actually going to be a ballerina. So, so I am a ballerina. No, I'm not, but I trained. I have a very, like, I joke around about it, but I have a very kind of a useless degree. I have a master's degree in classical percussion.
Here's to the useless degrees.
They teach you, but this is kind of like a funny aside. But when I was looking through some old boxes, and I found a letter that Don Wary wrote to me when I went to university when I was 18, and I never understood the content of the letter when I was that age, but I do now that I'm 54. But in the letter, he was basically saying congratulations for getting accepted to McGill. But underneath, he was saying, don't forget that you also have a lot of other interests and you don't know where this is going to lead you. And you could end up in film, or you could end up, with working with dance, and like basically every single thing that I do now.
Wow.
It saved me a lot of time. But it was very interesting because I think in hindsight, what he was trying to be supportive, but also saying, like, knowing in some way, like, you're probably not going to be a ballerina.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm curious how you also play piano. Is piano considered percussion?
It is, yeah. Technically, it is a percussion instrument, but the training and the technique is so different. I'm not a trained, I took lessons, but I'm not a disciplined
Uh-huh, uh-huh,
player. But I taught piano for a long time. Teach creative, well, I did teach creative music for 30 years.
uh-huh,
Yeah.
uh-huh.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I, I have to sort of, be very upfront that this is a realm that is pretty foreign for me. So it also, I'll say, Erin and I met at Sound Symposium, the 21st presentation of it, just this past July in St. John's in Newfoundland. And for me, it was such an eye-opening experience to be around all these musicians and performers, and I felt so like privileged to get a glimpse into this world that never really hasn't been my world. And to hear the conversations, like what are people talking about, and also to realize, oh, this is like a niche of this whole
Mhm.
world, and that for me was even like, of course it is, but like I hadn't thought about it before. And so you're saying, you sort of following getting into McGill and getting into a classical training without kind of knowing where you were headed, it makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that because I didn't think about how you were coming into Sound Symposium because the cool thing about that festival is there have always been performance artists, visual artists, um, but I always thought of them as musicians. The same as like I thought of you as a musician because you are using your voice, you're making vibration with your voice in a very deliberate way, and there's timing involved. Like with what I'm just thinking about, the performance that you did at LSPU. That it for I think Dawn and for me also, it's like that is the same as watching somebody play a percussion concert in that context. Do you know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah.
And that's
Yeah, I
why
do. I
so
do
we can
now.
yeah, so we and this is the conversation that I really like is and this is why I really like working across disciplines is that I can't understand my own process very much anymore when I'm only talking to musicians because we have a common language, so we don't talk about it anymore. But when I'm working with other people in other disciplines, it's like you're speaking this language and I'm speaking this language, and the languages aren't the same, but there's this other nonverbal world that we can both sort of swim in. And then I feel like I'm in new territory, and that's where I really like to be. I like to be in the new territory where I don't understand everything that's going on. That
Yeah,
do you know what I mean?
I do. Yeah. And, I'm just thinking, so to say, Erin, you created and I don't even know what words you're using. Directed, produced,
Both.
the big finale for Sound Symposium, which happened out at Cape Spear National Park, which is the easternmost point in North America. And it's an amazing landscapes, and we're right on the cliff's edge to the Atlantic Ocean. Frequently whales
Mhm.
uh, frolicking. It's a really stunning landscape, and you had something like 30 performers in all different disciplines that you were herding like cats, as they say.
Commanding. No, no, it was, yeah, that was a huge challenge. Like there were some things that were just a total dream come true about that event, things that I would never ever have been able to do if it weren't those exact circumstances. And then there were other things that were super challenging because of the timelines and um yeah. But I think I think that site, which is so stunning, and I'm just gonna talk for a second just about just while you were talking, it brought up something for me. So like when I started doing concert halls, like when you're playing classical music, it's everything's in a hall. And I like how everything's controlled and dark, and I always sort of like that world, when you go out of your rehearsal and it's bright daylight and you feel like a vampire. Like I love that. I could sit in a dark movie theater all day. But I think the thing about that started drawing me to the outside is that in a theater, you're asking everyone to ignore all kinds of things. Like you're asking people to suspend their belief about where they are and transport themselves to a different world or different room. But you're also asking people to like ignore the exit signs, ignore
Hmm.
the ushers, ignore the person talking, ignore the whatever. So I started getting really interested in the opposite of that, which would be what if you don't ignore anything? So every place that I go to, that's kind of my first thing is like, what if I just expand my vision, expand my hearing, expand what I know about the place itself, and just try to create something that all the material is being generated from the space itself. That's why
Hmm.
I like working outside for all its challenges. So I'm trying to be like, I see a lot of outdoor shows that are like theater shows that someone just picked up and plopped outside, which
Right.
is fine, like, plein air, whatever, theater, like that's great. I love that. But, and even a lot of things that are designed for outside, like some of the really, big names in, outdoor sound, Murray Schafer and things like that, which are really inspiring to me. But also inspiring, but also I always had questions like,
Hmm.
why are why are we not leaving space for the sounds that were already in the space? Or yeah, do you know what I mean? So I
Yeah.
like I'm interested more in like meeting what's going on in the space and reflecting back what's there to encourage a different type of listening or a different type of seeing, or
Yeah.
even maybe a different type of being.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because certainly in the visual art world, when there's such a difference between making something in your studio, say, and then putting it outside, suddenly it just becomes like teeny, you
yeah.
know? So is it similar with
Same. That was the huge challenge. Like I wished we'd had a month to make like something in that space, because with the dance, that was the constant thing. It's like we had all these plans to have dancers way off in the distance, and it's like, oh, they're gonna get dwarfed. Like in this landscape, they just look like ants off as an ant. So then we were like experimenting with big fabric and things that show the wind and all this. And then of course we designed something not thinking that we had a huge audience. And so actually the audience in some ways kind of was so present that some of the things that are planned become smaller because of the size of the audience, right? So there's so many things and you never know. And that's kind of part of the fun of it too. Like, and then there's weather, and then there's how quiet is the audience going to be, or what is the natural acoustic and how does that change when it's windy. And so it's kind of a game. It's a dangerous game. You're playing with the elements.
Yeah, sorry, my neighbor's cat just came in
Oh,
my house.
okay.
Hi,
Well,
kitty.
no, let's
No,
not
there it
ignore
goes.
any.
No, no, my cat. Surprised me. Yeah, that is so interesting because, I think about, well, I also would love to talk about the people you have collaborated with on many projects. There's a handful of people, but one thing I noted when you and Suzanne especially were coordinating the Cape Spear piece, it's just like it basically it's impossible. There's all these people and we're all wandering around and have our
Oh,
own agendas and
yeah,
and I don't know, it also for me is just like so alive because of that. Like you say, the audience too, who knew there were going to be like over 200 people showing up, right?
yeah,
And then the audience becomes an element in the performance, right? And completely unpredictable, like you said. Are they going to be noisy? Are they going to be quiet? But it's so alive. It's so in the
yeah.
moment.
And we're all in it together. And that's like part of the I guess, if you're measuring your own success, I have a funny criteria for measuring success, I think. But um, if the audience feels engaged enough, I think, to be part of the piece, then it's success for me. And I really felt that in the Cape Spear piece, um, that that could have gone a very different way.
Good of.
They decided that all the moving from piece to piece was their time to like chat and catch up, which is, that's what I like to do. But they didn't do that. Like everybody was, I mean, we set them up, as I say, being a parent, as we set them up for success. Like we bring them in right at the beginning, like you were a really critical part of that show and you absolutely understood the assignment right away. And we're adjusting all the time. I was totally blown away by what you did, but that makes a huge difference. It's almost, there's a psychology to it too, like you're showing people like what is the listening quality and what are we trying to do, and either they'll buy into it or they won't. They're
Yeah.
invited to buy into it, doesn't mean they're going to buy into it. But I
Yeah.
felt like we did, and even with subtle things like how are you putting sound into that space, like that's why the first piece that we created was like people walking down a pathway and ringing these bells. And for me, that it might seem like nothing's going on, and a lot of times I find with things that I think are successful, people don't think there's anything going on, but there is something going on. It's like you're allowing the natural sound in the environment to still be present. So you're allowing people's ears to be open. You're not saying, oh, now focus on this amplified piece, and we're giving you a piece and you need to focus on this piece. We're saying, expand your listening and take in like the ocean, take in the wind. And then these bells are like actually part of that environment. So I think psychologically, you can invite people in those ways also, and it's like a walking meditation too. So there's almost like a labyrinth type feel, like where now we're all walking together, and it almost looks like something you'd see in like medieval times or something, all of us walking in this kind of more, it's not just pedantic walking, it's like there's a pace to it and there's a quality that we're showing in the
Yes.
environment, right? So um, and even just, it's a hard thing to convey sometimes to musicians because musicians are used to, my job is to put my instrument in my mouth and just blow and the notes come out, like that's kind of how we're trained. So um, when you show people what that looks like they'll just adjust right away. Like, oh, actually, no, I'm not just like whacking my thing as I walk down the thing. I'm actually holding space for what's going on around me, and I'm adding to this environment with my one sound. That's just one part of many.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
type of collaboration I find really interesting, and not everybody will fully get into it. But I actually like the mishmash of people who are super in it and other people who are just in it at the level that they can be or want to be. I kind of like that because it's a bridge between the audience and the performers too.
Yeah. 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 And when I think of that bell piece in particular, as like, I also think about it's interesting that space at Cape Spear is so sort of vast. It's like there's no trees, you're just the land and the sky and the ocean, and scale is really huge, and right as it began, some fog came in, and then the foghorn started at the lighthouse, which I don't know, to me, and this is what I heard from people who were in the audience, was something about the way the bells then were in kind of responding to the foghorn really helped create that, like a container. That's the word that I keep thinking of, like the
Ah, that's cool.
container of
Yeah,
it. Yeah. So we
that's
didn't feel like, oh yeah,
yeah, because it could feel like that outside. And often, like the joke that we make, and I make this joke all the time with Suzanne, at a certain challenging point in the process, we'll always be like, hey, someone should invent like an enclosed space that has a built-in acoustic, has, it's like a place where you can buy tickets and washrooms. And we were like, oh, that's a theater. We always make that joke because like it's like a reminder, like we asked for this, like we set up these
Yeah.
parameters that are kind of impossible. Like you said, I sort of like that. Um, yeah, and The other word that you used is container, and I often call the pieces containers because, and I had an interesting talk with Jeff about this after the show, because I think when you're used to working in concert halls, you can control everything. So then you start to get uncomfortable with things you can't control. So the rehearsal period tends to be like, how can we get rid of all the things we can't control? And if you try to do that outside, it's just, you may as well give up before you've started because there's going to be 100 things that you can't control. So now it almost feels like a type of surfing or something where you're like, okay, uh, okay, one thing I've learned is like basically you can't prescribe every single thing, so you have to leave room for people to make decisions in the moment because the parameters are changing all the time. So it's like, what is the right amount of information for the performers to have? And what
Mm,
is too much information that's going to create up this tension where it's like, oh, I'm trying to control something that I can't control. So, oh, I
right.
never articulated this before. I'm learning something myself. This is good. Because I said to him after, like, because he wanted to control a lot more. Like he wanted to be like, I want to conduct this part, I want to lead, I want to talk to the audience, I want to lead them and tell them what's happening. And I was just like, no, because it actually, for me, it kind of works better to feel those things in the moment. If you're an improviser, which we all are, we all were, then you can say, oh, the audience actually didn't do what I thought they were going to do. So I am now going to adjust and show them visually. And the performers kind of step into their role with more ownership
Mm-hmm.
than
Mm-hmm.
just standing and going, oh, I was supposed to do this, but that's not going to work. And now I don't know what to do.
Right. Right. Yeah, super interesting. It's like how much information actually is useful to create the freedom, and then when does it become like rigid? And then people get like, wait, I'm supposed to be there, but now everyone's standing there and I can't get there, and
Yeah.
yeah,
And
yeah,
that doesn't look good from an audience point of view. It looks like, uh-oh, if they're confused now, I don't feel
right,
comfortable.
right, right.
Yeah.
Even talking now, it's like, oh, if you don't mind, it's just my own experience of doing a lot of public participatory work,
Yeah.
uh, visual work. I learned early on I can have every idea in my head of what I think the piece is,
Yeah.
and usually the within the first 5 minutes,
It's
I see
crazy.
like, oh, none of that's happening. Okay.
Yes, yes, I totally know. But that's what makes it alive. That then it's alive. That's what happens in outdoor. Like maybe it happens indoors too, but I don't think it does as much in outdoor because then you are actually paying attention to what the reality is of your situation. You're not just imposing. And when people impose something in too much, I feel like the audience will disengage a little bit because they're like, "Oh, you're
Yeah.
showing me a movie of what you want me to see." And what I'm interested in, and I think what you're interested in, based on what I observed, um, is not that. It's like, what is this relationship in this place at this time with this audience?
Yeah. 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 It was very, I don't know, just to be as one of the people that got to be part of it, I'll say, it just was so, and it was enlivening, and I don't know. Yeah, again, I'll go back to the scale. It was really inspiring to be like, oh,
Mm,
how how to work in such a vast, activate such a vast space,
yeah,
and then activate and then keep it activated. What was it? About 90 minutes or something.
yeah. It was only really an hour and 15, which I thought it was going to be longer, but I mean, I had planned for it to be an hour and 15, and then I
Okay.
thought it turned into something that was way longer, but it was 1:15 because those transitions were so smooth. And we didn't talk to the audience and have stop and start and applause between and all those things. So I like keeping that. That's why I don't like a lot of talking unless it's something that's also part of the, you know, creative part of the show, like it was in our show.
Right.
Because when you go back and forth from mundane, like, oh, everyone find a seat and blah blah blah, like then you're taking people in and out of the
Right.
like
Peace.
whatever that is, their magic word.
Yeah. Well,
Um,
can I
yeah.
circle back and ask, so just to mention, it's you were saying Jeff Riley is a bass clarinetist. I'm sure also plays other instruments as well, and was uh, for at least part of it partnered with me as we were moving around, and he sort of ended up being the person really leading everybody
Oh,
with his music and his presence.
yeah.
Um, I learned a lot from working with him. And so, but I was also very impressed with your clarity. So, like when he was saying, "Oh, I think I should be doing XYZ," and you were just super clear, like, no. You know?
If people noticing it.
But I mean that in the best way because I don't know, is that something that you've had to cultivate or that just comes
Oh,
very natural for
yes.
you?
So this is another thing that goes into the plus column for me because I could not have done that maybe even 5 years ago. I would not have done that. So this is also something I like about being 54 because that part of your life where you're like, I have no F's to give. Now I'm there now, and I wish I'd been there a lot longer. But Jeff and I have a really long relationship because he's a CBC producer. He just retired from that job, but he worked with my dad, who used to be regional director in Halifax. So when I was young, like when I was in high school, I looked up to Jeff, and he was like a big producer. I used to go and see his sessions, and I thought like when I grow up, I want to be Jeff. And then subsequently, Jeff and I worked together uh, through like playing music, but he often is conducting upstream orchestra, which I'm part of. So like he's always in that role where he's guiding, he's leading. And I don't do very much here, like the outdoor shows. I've only done one big one in my own area. So there's a lot of musicians that actually here that don't know that that's kind of my main interest. So he's
Uh-huh.
never really seen me in that role before. And he
Uh-huh.
is like, he said to me after the show, he's like, "Oh, I see. Like, I'm a producer and you're a producer, and that's why we ended." And I was like, "Yeah, but I was the producer of this show, Jeff." Like, so it's not like I'm not open to his ideas. Like I'm always listening to everybody's ideas. But what I've learned is if it's going to work better another way, there's no conversation. Like it's not a conversation. Like because there's so many decisions that have to be made.
Yeah.
If I
Yeah.
know in my heart I'm not going to give over anymore to people that I love you, Jeff, that don't have the same experience that I do with outdoor shows because I've been making outdoor shows for 25 years. So I've just learned stuff. It's not
Yeah.
like I have all the answers, but if I've done that more than you and you are convinced that it's only going to work a certain way, I'm not going to change what I know is going to work and then find out later, oh, I was right, like that didn't work, you know?
Right, right, right.
But yeah, that took me a long time. And also, I never used to, yeah, I used to just give over a lot. And you can't because there's too many decisions that have to be made. So it's like what I guess this is what I've learned because I sound like a battle axe who I'm not a battle axe, I don't think. But I think where I want people to be really collaborative is the content of the containers. Then you
Mhm.
can pretty much do what you want. Like unless there's something that I really feel strongly about. Then we can collaborate on it together. I'm not going to come into someone's piece and tell them what to do. But in terms of the logistics and the overall flow, I know how to do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's not like I'm closed to other people's ideas, but I'm very confident having navigated people through these type of things for a long time. I don't know if there's many people that know how to do that more than I do. So yay,
Yeah.
I'm all of it.
Yeah. Yeah. Own it. Yeah. Yeah. And I think, just what you were saying with if the audience starts to feel hesitation with the performers, I think if you had been kind of wishy-washy, it would have been harder on our end to really like step into what we were doing. So
That's
it's
right. That's right. And I've learned that the hard way because I've had people say to me, like years ago, people would feel uncomfortable because they don't think someone is taking care of them, or they're not in charge, or no, like they're unsure. Or I've had people say to me, like 2 days before a show, I had somebody who was the stage manager say to me, you know what this show needs? It needs a director. And I was like, oh, I'm the director. Like they've been part of that process and not noticed that I'm
Yeah.
directing. I kind of thought about that. It's like, and I know, like talking to other directors, because I don't have any training as a director, so I'm almost was bashful to even call myself that. But a
Mhm.
lot of the directors that I do know, there's and a lot of, good lighting designers and a lot of good composers, they're like, basically, if you do your job right, nobody even knows what you're doing. And I've done shows where people don't even credit me at all for the show that I created. Like they don't even
Mm.
know that I was involved, or
Mm.
I'll see pictures of my show, like, I saw pictures of my show in the Globe and Mail once, but had no credit for like what the show was, what my role was, and so I
Oh,
changed my mind about, oh, I don't like being tooting my own horn or whatever, but if you create something and your imprint, your creative imprint is kind of all over it, then to not be even associated with it at all, that must be something that you're doing. Like,
yeah.
it's a,
Yeah.
it's a gender thing too, right?
Yeah, for sure. 100%. Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this. I mean, now just as you're talking, I'm like, yeah, collaboration doesn't mean 50-50, you know,
Yeah.
necessarily, right? It could, but it's not necessarily a democracy, like, period.
Well, I've tried so many different types of collaboration, and I think this is maybe a common thing, but like when you're younger, I really wanted to break out of that hierarchy thing, where because classical music, it can be so toxic with like conductors and,
Yeah.
that's a whole other conversation. But I really wanted to break out of that and be like, okay, we have a 13 performer group and we are all equal and every decision is made equally. That does not work in my experience. That does
Yeah.
not work.
Yeah.
And I've learned a lot trying to do things that way, and I'm watching other people try to do things that way. I kind of like the idea of it. But for me, it's more highly collaborative if I'm taking care of a lot of the logistics and the creative overview, and then all the people that are involved can be their own creative selves. I'm paying attention to who the people are and what I see as being like, what are their really strong creative gifts, and then I'm putting containers around what they already do. So I'm not asking people to do something that they're not already really good at. And I don't feel ownership over those pieces, like
Yeah.
those belong
Yeah.
to the performers.
To me, that is such a, like, that is an art to really, like, draw out what is so strong about the people you're working with, but not and I do think, particularly as women, we have to learn how to be in charge,
Yeah,
and be in charge not in a way that's just replicating, like you say, a kind of toxic
right.
system. I've actually been thinking a lot about, in my mind, I've been calling it like power, but like, to own one's power without, yeah, without replicating these terrible systems of oppression, but
Yeah.
with, how to move through the world, but that isn't,
Mm.
uh, yeah, like squashing your gifts.
You
But
know,
yeah,
I
yeah.
took I spent a lot of time thinking about this, and to be honest, I don't have the best experience with these things in my life. I'm trying new ways now, but I'm going to be really honest, like they don't always feel good afterwards.
Mm,
Afterwards, I feel like I wish I lived in a world where I didn't have to spend that much energy to take control over something that is actually mine. Like, why do I need to step outside myself and be more aggressive than I want to be? Like, why don't people just be like, oh, she's in charge. She seems like she knows what she's doing. Like most people do. Most people do.
right,
But it takes a toll. Like, it does take a bit of a toll. I think it's better than the other thing where you just give away your power to other people who are more confident or they're more used to being in charge. Uh,
right.
because I have two daughters that are now adults, and part of me just wants to be like, I really want them to be in situations where the men that are involved with their projects are just going to respect the fact that
They're in charge.
they're in charge,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah, there's a lot of social conditioning there for sure.
Social conditioning. And I don't know, because then in the end, it's lonely. It's a little bit lonely because if you have to kind of like fight for the things that you want. I mean, I'm making it more dramatic than it was, but there were some absolutely straight ahead collaboration is different for everyone. But I'm talking about gender roles, and I feel like I do have something to say about this because in percussion, it's so male dominated that my whole life has been about being the only woman in the room,
Yeah.
right? So I have probably way more experience with that than a lot of people. And um, I mean, I've said this before, but it's like growing up in Newfoundland was kind of strange because Don Wary, who he really, there were no, like, this is back in the, early 80s. There didn't appear to be any difference between how the women and the girls were treated and how the boys, so it was a bit of unusual. And then it's not a coincidence that those students, the male students that are my peers and friends now, they don't seem to have that built into
Hmm.
their, I didn't
Hmm.
get that until a few years ago, but I think it's because that's how it was taught to them. But pretty much
Hmm.
every other place that I've lived, that's not been the case. So I didn't have the armor to like go into a situation like McGill, where it was 25 guys and me,
Hmm.
and a really misogynistic teacher. Um, I didn't know what to do, and I didn't understand what that was. And then that's subsequently been a lot of my life since then. So when I go back to Newfoundland, it's like, I don't have to deal with this nonsense.
Well, I'm thrilled to hear that. That part of it, but yeah, yeah, it's such a I don't know. You don't have to answer this, but it's also something I've been thinking a lot about, which is when when I've stepped in, like, and kind of owned my power in a particular way, especially around my art and performing. There's I the next day I often have a backlash of like what feels like shame to
Got it.
me.
Oh yeah, me too.
And
I know,
it's not like it's like the icky shame. It's not a good shame.
what
It's
is
like
that?
not
Like,
a
what?
misplaced shame.
Right. So what? But where is that coming from? Is that you feeling like embarrassed that you had to take more than you were
No,
comfortable?
it's more like a like how dare I put myself forward like that.
Yeah, I feel that. I feel that, but I think it's easier for me to think about it when I hear you say it than when it is when I feel that.
Hmm.
Like
Hmm.
it always is. Because I don't want you to feel that. I want you to just be in your power, and that's a healthy
Right.
thing for you, and you don't feel it. But see, it's nice to say it out loud because then it's like, oh, but I don't do that.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, that's something it's really good to articulate because this conversation is very interesting because we don't usually articulate these kind of things. And I think I could be wrong about this, but I feel like sometimes people that are in visual art or dance or theater, like we tend to have more conversations that are about like the why of what we're doing or how are we doing. But in music, it's like, what measure are we starting on and what stick like we don't talk about this kind of stuff,
Hmm.
right? So that's another reason why I like working outside of discipline.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Yes, I so appreciate that you do span all these media and genre and even now as you're saying that I'm like, yeah, it's like bringing in all the senses, and
Yeah.
um yeah, in such a beautiful way.
Oh, thank you. I felt like it was really great. Like part of my goal in Sound Symposium was like creating new connections because often what happens there is you don't have time necessarily to create new collaborations, which was kind of the whole idea at the beginning of the festival. So I've always been saying to Kathy, like, oh, I would love to come and create something that allows people to just collaborate with people they might not ordinarily and I was thinking about it as an outsider, but actually what ended up happening was like, oh, I met people like you know, who I would love to collaborate with again because I just felt like we just really understood each other. And you're bringing something like usually in that role, I wouldn't have someone that had like a performance art background. So it ends up being a little bit more like I'll have a theater person.
Mhm.
It ends up being more like physically leading people through the space. But I have been craving, and then you really brought that fully into fruition for me. Is like, but what you're doing is it is an improv, and it is part of the sound world and the visual world, and bridges like the audience with the performers, and it does a lot of things rather than just be like, welcome everyone, and now let's walk down the path, which is kind of what I have done more in the past, not always, but sometimes. So it makes me want to go further in that direction because I can see the potential
Mhm.
that
Mhm.
like the person the audience is following also has a relationship to the land and can, you know, show that or embody it, I think, more.
Yeah. 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 Well, first, thank you for saying all that, those nice things. But it was, yeah, it was super fun to have that experience. And yeah, and I feel like likewise, it sort of totally opened my eyes to like, oh, wait a minute, there's all these other senses that can be activated.
Whether you're conscious of it or not, you were already doing that. Like even just from looking at, you know, the videos on your website, or like I could tell a lot from your website. It's like, oh, and just the way you're putting like a visual art piece in the landscape, like you were saying. So it's not dwarfed. It's like I
Right.
can't remember exactly, but you had this one outside of a building, and it's like a blue.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Like I even just from that one image, I'm like, oh, she kind of gets that proportion and you know how
Right.
like I like
Right.
I'm not a visual artist, but maybe I am. I don't know. Like I like adding certain colors to the landscape in a certain way that are not they're not the same as what's in the landscape, but they're sort of like a heightened version of what's in the
Yeah.
landscape. Like,
Yeah.
for me, I don't know why I have to think about that more, but that's an important part of what I do because I feel like it's kind of like the way humans walk through the earth. It's like we are part of the natural world, but we sure don't act like it.
Right.
You know? So I like kind of there's like a friction there that I really like, and your character really brought some of that out, like with the big plastic, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting too because you know some outdoor things can, and some of the things that I've made can seem like, oh, I'm just being um like life is beautiful and we are just one with the universe. Like that's never what I'm trying to show, even though I can see like why it would look like that. Like the Woodlight film that I made in the pandemic, I could see how you might look at that and go, well, that's like just a beautiful thing. But for me, it's a very sad thing.
Uh-huh.
It's like
Uh-huh.
it's like a grief piece. Like, yeah, maybe we don't belong here. We're getting evicted really
Yeah.
soon because we kind of messed it up. That's kind of how that felt to me, you know, making that. Uh,
Yeah. Well, maybe that's a good segue. I feel like we could just keep talking, which would be great, but it would be great to show some of you have a couple videos that you picked out.
yeah,
And
why not
I
share?
also really want to talk about the West Iron.
Oh, West Armband, yeah, sure.
Yeah. Just because for me watching, I watched the videos that you sent, and I mean that one really like made me tear up.
Mhm.
This
Okay,
is
that's
so
interesting. That's
beautiful.
another sort of a well, I'll give a backstory on the West Ironbound piece because the West Ironbound, I don't know how to explain this. Okay, so in the pandemic, like right in the middle of the pandemic, I have a trio called BOG, which is short for Becoming Old Growth. And that's with Suzanne Choi, who was also the choreographer for the Cape Spear Show. And she's the art co-artistic director for Motion Dance here in Halifax. And we collaborate a lot, and I'm very lucky to have Suzanne. And then this beautiful poet and visual artist, Basma Kavanaugh, who I also collaborate with a lot. And we were invited to do this. It was a pilot project from the Kingsburg Coastal Conservancy, and they own an island off the coast of Nova Scotia that is uninhibited, like uninhabited. Oh, and we were uninhibited while we were there. Interesting. But there's a beautiful little house, and they were contemplating having artist residencies out there, which they did for a short time. So we were the first residency to go out there. But this was like the craziest part of the pandemic. Basma was going through a lot. Suzanne was going through a lot. She had, she was in deep grief. And at a moment, we thought maybe we shouldn't do this because everyone's kind of coming apart. And then at the last minute, we thought, well, let's just do it, whatever. And even if, you're in your room crying the whole time and we don't talk to each other, whatever, we're just going to go for it. So we went out there and we actually got storm stayed out there. So it was quite dramatic because you're really alone. Like
Uh-huh.
I've never been that alone before. There's no one out there. There's sheep grazing. Um, so, and you can't leave, you get dropped off in a boat. And then when the bad weather came, they said, do you want to evacuate early or you might get stuck out there for a while? And we decided to get stuck out there for a while. So our residency became us just almost like children, just we became almost like weirdly not that verbal. And we would just wander out the door and just kind of walk around and sometimes crawl around the forest. And it was weird. We became almost like an organism. And then we would come back and do like writing prompts or, movement or improvise with music. So it was a really interesting and very strange time. So we took this rough kind of cell phone video, and the intention was to go back, and we were just test shooting, and we were supposed to go back with a film crew and actually make a film. And then we got, you can only cross if it's like crossing the ocean, and it's pretty scary actually. Both days that we planned to do the shoot, we couldn't because of weather. So we ended up just piecing together this video with what we shot on our cell phones and a little bit of drone footage that one of the filmmakers had from the island. So that's what this is. That was a long preamble, but that's what this is.
All right. Wow. Um, I love hearing that background. I'm just getting the share set up here.
I think you can feel it. Like, well, maybe I'm too deep into it, but it's like there is a certain feeling in that. It's just a rough film, but I'm really proud of it because I think it did sort of, it's like a moment in time that we were all really involved with. Oh, and
Yeah.
I should say the music. Um, there was another collaborator, Marla Benton, who's a ceramic artist she came out with me for a few days and then she left and the other two came. So she built, I'll show you, she made these ceramic instruments and you can hear them on the soundtrack, but basically she made these on the island. And so you can hear them in the
Mhm.
background.
Mhm. All right. Okay. Okay. Let me know if you can't hear it. I should be able to.
The ever moving, the ever moving air, atmosphere, a web, robing every inch of earth, of us, a loose and flexible skin mingling with the unbreathable beyond and the ever moving, the
Yeah, it looks like it's just stop and stop.
ever moving ocean.
Might be my internet.
Sky molds to that restless surface, translating infinite adjustment as delicate gesture, perpetual motion. Unknowable depths touch the engine of earth formation, magma roiling from a molten core to cool, seafloors and mountains born from the fluid, ever-moving rock, supple and contorted, fold upon fold, grown with unfathomable slowness. Land, island, jut of rock climb towards the surface, extend from unlit trenches to sky, immersed and emerging, awash in the ever moving light, a glittering intelligence, animating substance, inventing form, alive in all directions, bodied in wave and matter, a luminous stream, interrupted by rock, water, flesh, light stopped, stalled, scattered. Drops of darkness cling where they fall, glide effortless, attuned with light. Shadows, shadowing. On every inch of ever turning earth, waves of light, air, water, gnaw away centuries of peat and root, rock and soil. Tides climb, retreat, clasp. Light clasps and sticks, peels and probes at invisible scales, bleaching, weathering wood, skin, stone. The intricate dance choreographed by gravity. Attraction binding cobbles to beach, bodies and trees, birds at their preferred blue depths, ever present, shaping foot, feather, branch, the ever moving energy of leap and grasp, of flight and falling, subtle glow of merge and cleft, release and hold, the lilt and lift of resistance, ballast, bodies held, weightless shroud of ever moving air, gown of ever moving light, life force aroused, housed in the shrine of
Well, my apologies.
Yeah, that's probably just the internet, right?
Yeah, I think it just, oops, it can't quite handle
Yeah.
both being
Probably
recorded and
got you. I probably have,
sorry.
I was trying to troubleshoot that while it was
No.
going anyway. You kind of get the idea, but I'm trying to think if I have, um, just while we're chatting, I'll see if I can find, if we're going to look at another video. I think I have them downloaded so I can, it would be
Oh,
easy.
okay. Yeah. If somebody, I mean, I'm really sorry that we can't see that, but we saw most of it. Yeah, in a bit of a jagged way.
Have the Woodlight ones all downloaded, so we could definitely, if that comes up, we could just watch them right off my thing.
Well, do
Yeah.
you want to maybe do you want to show one more? I'll make you a host so that you can share
Oh,
your
right. Okay.
and yeah, it would be good to look at least one more, right?
Yeah, exactly. We'll look at the Green Moss Meadow, which was I made three short films in the pandemic um, around the same time with Suzanne Choi and also a poet, Alice Burdick, who is Alice Burdick and Basma Kavanaugh are really great poets that everyone should look up and read. Underrated, but Alice also lives in Mahone Bay, and so we kind of set a goal for ourselves to make these three. It's a marriage between poetry and dance and the natural world and music. So this is kind of the simplest one in a way, but it's I think anyway, I'm really proud of these films. They took a long time to put together. So I'll see if I can get this going here. I'm so clunky with technology.
You know, somehow you got forced into it.
No, it's okay. Like under duress, I can do it. All right. So and I just go share, correct?
Yeah, and then you have to just pick the screen you want to share.
Cool. So if I go here, and then this should work. Share.
Yeah.
Look. I'm gonna make this, oops, no.
I can see it.
Got it. Okay, there we go. I was trying to make it fill the whole screen and
Oh,
not. Okay, here we go.
Hemlocks waver at the cover. Open walls of tall trunks. Soft ground glows bright circles of green. Trees remember history, shape tall shadows. Deep green light underwater, deep past. Time lapse, timeless patience. Endless growth and decay. Trees breathe all over me.
Yeah, so that's the idea of that. I have to figure out how to turn it off.
Here we go.
Now I don't know where it is. It exists somewhere in the ether. Let's see. I don't know. It's interesting. I don't know where it went either.
It should end, right? There we go.
About to end. Yeah, and so like just one thing that we really wanted to try to do was like the you know, you can do all this stuff with finding audio online and adding birds and stuff, but actually that is the audio from what the actual, which is a
Mhm.
pain in the neck, to be honest. I understand why people do it the other way. But, you know, that to me, it's like a real imprint of that space at that in that time, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, yeah, so the other films, one of them she's completely in water, and the other one she's in a dead tree that it was a really beautiful tree that's in a field. So she actually never really puts her feet on the ground in any of the three films, which was kind of important to me too. So it's all these other sort of relationships with land and a little bit um, human, but not really human at the same time, whatever that means. But it just felt like um, I guess, you know, when I see things where people are in spaces, it always seems like because of our brains and the amount of, you know, media that we consume, it's like humans are always have to be the most important thing, you know, and what they're saying and the word, like the words they're saying. But for me, it's like I like to be in the world where it's like the human part is in relation to all the other things and isn't necessarily the most important thing, even though that's the subject in the shot. Like the
Mhm.
maybe the leaves are just as important, or maybe the the moss has as much interest, or the shadow has as much interest. It's not what is the subject and what is the information that I'm supposed to be receiving.
Yeah. 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 I really took in, well, especially at the end, that sort of from above, but sort of looking back now, if that was an end image, I don't know, there was like a moment where I was like, oh, like she feels so fragile and tiny and like almost like not even born infant in there, like the movement too is, and there was something very vulnerable and almost scary, like in a scary way of like, oh, so tiny and fragile. And yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, I know what you mean. Even though like yeah, it's sometimes like non-dancers will be like, well, where's the dance? And sometimes I get that a lot in my shows where people are like, where was the dancing? It's like, well, that is the dancing. You know, it's like that. You know, and Suzanne, I think really we're really on the same trajectory in terms of like how we're thinking about movement, and that those films have been very well received in the dance film community, which was great because that's the first time I've ever made a film. But I don't know. I think dancers kind of have that relationship to what's around them already. So, um, anyway, it's just an, I guess all of this just feels like a big experiment. Like I have a really strong impulse to investigate certain types of questions. That's it. That's all that it is, really.
Yeah.
And attentiveness. Like it's like, oh, if I'm being attentive, then what is it that I want to pay attention to?
Yeah. Yeah.
Rather than I want to create a series of sounds or a series of movements and then
Mhm.
put them in various places and see what happens. That's also interesting. Like I think that is interesting, and I have done that in the past. Um, well, actually, I learned a lot doing that. Like in earlier here shows, which were more about. I really like contemporary music, so it's like, how can I make contemporary music more accessible? This was an experiment for a long time. It's like, oh, actually, you could do anything outside, and people will get in.
That's right.
Like
Right.
it's a equalizer, like being outside. We all have a relationship to being outside and being in, you know, interesting, beautiful spaces. So it takes away that, ooh, I just bought a ticket and I'm in my seat and now I'm being accosted by music that I don't, it feels strange to me. But I found that you could just do anything. Like I've done the craziest contemporary music outside. And then I would always try to like soften it by doing pieces that I thought people would like more. And then what I just learned really fast is people were really drawn to the more contemporary because they can tell it has like an integrity, like we're all really into it, and you
Yeah.
know, just, and you could really do a lot of things outside that would I think people might not feel as connected to in a theater.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
maybe.
Well, there's definitely that barrier of entry. I mean, forgetting even the ticket price, but
Right.
like actually like put yourself inside the building. Yeah.
Yeah. And you can also move, like you can be farther away if you want to, and you could completely ignore something if you want to and just look at the look at the ocean or whatever. Like you don't you're
Mm.
not trapped. Like I think in an art gallery, how people move through an art gallery is it's always interesting to me. It's like there's you don't have to stay long, you know? And people
Right.
stay remarkably short amounts of time in art galleries. They just literally walk past like a incredible thing, you know, they just like breeze past. Um,
Right.
it's because you have autonomy, I guess, over like what your movements are. Uh,
Yeah.
but in concert hall, it's not really like that. And I think about that a lot, and because I've seen a lot of shows too, it's like I don't like that feeling of being trapped and like, oh, you're here for 2 hours or more, you know.
Right. Right.
So you're making a choice too, and you're also making a choice about like where do you want to see something from close or from a distance, or there isn't necessarily like one place to be. Oh,
Yeah.
and the other thing that I'm still experimenting with that I'm still fascinated by is that people will say, when I go back to that place, now that place is different to me because
Mm.
residue, the imprint of whatever was created, is part of that space now. And I was so fascinated by that that I created like I did an outdoor show here 13 years ago called Burn Water with Suzanne. That was our first real big collaboration. And people were saying that now when I go back to those spaces, I always see this piece in my mind. And so I made a whole theater piece about sort of the opposite of that, like trying to bring the residue of what happened outside back into the concert hall.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
That was almost like an obsession for me. And I brought like the sound of the place into the room, and there were images of what happened outside, but it was more just like I tried to keep the feeling of what happened, and
How did it go?
it was amazing because I learned by mistake that this is possible because I designed this big outdoor show in Banff, and it was a collaboration with Parks Canada and the Banff Center, and it I had a contract that said if it is going to rain, because we had violins and cellos and harps, this show gets canceled. There's no indoor version of this show. It's canceled. And so the day before it said 100% chance of rain. And so then the BAM Center came to me and said, you have to do something inside because all of our funders that funded this project are coming to see the thing and they need to see something. And, I was a lot younger then and I was like, oh, okay. So I basically pulled an all-nighter with the choreographer and we made something, and it wasn't even in a theater. It was in one of those big, ugly rehearsal spaces with the fluorescent lights. And it was awful. It was one of the hardest things I've ever done. But what was interesting is we didn't have time to adjust from understanding the outdoor spaces, which was on this beautiful glacier lake, and people were in the water and swimming. And it's like, how are we going to do this inside? So we didn't have time to adjust. And what people said was, I don't know why, but I felt like I was outside.
Huh.
And I just became completely obsessed with that for like years and years. I was like, how? I don't understand. I still don't totally understand, but I think it's we brought something with us that came out into that room. So then I
Mm.
worked forever trying to like reproduce that in various ways just because I was trying to turn it over and see what was going on. And so we made the Bankhead or sorry, we made Burnwater, which was site specific for Eastover. And then we made two other shows, theater shows that toured Burnwater Alchemy and Burnwater Arrival, which was like an installation that people could move through inside,
Mm-hmm.
go into a little tent, and there were things that they could make sound with, and there was like a little workshop and all these. Yeah, so it was like it was still that same feeling of flowing through a space and meeting these different it's hard to talk about this stuff, but it wasn't like, you're sitting in a seat.
Right.
People
Right.
talks, and we like I don't know if you can see in my corner. Wait, I'll bring you show and tell time. Um, these rock pillows that are in the corner of my studio.
Oh, uh-huh.
there are like tons and tons and tons of those. And they were like seating for the audience, but also uh, pathways, and there was a little bridge that you had to cross over, and it was like these elements of things that have happened that I like the idea of like transitioning from one state to another state. So all these things that kind of embodied those feelings.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
it's also like a big tree that had leaves that you could take the leaves on and off. And the performers kind of model, like in the installation version, they're showing that activity, but then
Uh-huh.
you might give a leaf to an audience member, and then they start almost like building the space with you. Like you don't have
Hmm.
to show much. This is why I feel like I know a lot about how to move audiences through spaces and what
Yeah.
works to get people involved, because we've done all these various experiments that have allowed us to sort of look and learn about how people want to interact with spaces or not.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Super interesting. All of it. So good. So good. I feel like we could keep going and going and going. And I hope we will
I hope we
continue.
will. I mean,
Yeah.
I have so much to learn too. Like I want to learn more about, I always feel a little bit like out of my depth with visual artists, but I'm very drawn to it. So um yeah, like we should do something. What are we gonna do?
Yeah. Well, for now, if people want to see more and watch the other videos that you referenced, the best place is on the Here Here website.
Yes. Yeah. So it's here like HEARHERE
Uh-huh.
productions. Dot.
So yeah, we'll put that in the description and the link so people can spend their time over there.
Yeah, and soon you'll be able to see the show that Robin was involved with. We don't have that up yet, but there's some great photos and soon to be video from that event too.
Yeah, looking forward to that. So maybe, so this will be November, so maybe it'll be up by then.
Might be up by then. Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
thank you so much for sharing.
It was my
You're
absolute pleasure.
so good to talk to you, always.
I love the idea of learning more about process. I think that's for me right now where I'm at. That's what I'm mostly interested in, is how people, what their processes are.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you for sharing yours.
You're very welcome.